beard and kind eyes standing next to a blue Peterbilt. "That is Derdine," Roy said. "I knew him personally. He used to stop here every week on his regular run, always worried about other drivers, always quick to help." Jake studied the photograph, his hands trembling slightly. "This is impossible." "I thought so too, until I started keeping track," Roy said, pulling out a small notebook. "I have been documenting every report I hear about radio warnings at mile marker 26, 47 incidents over 12 years. Every single warning was accurate. Every single driver who slowed down avoided an accident." The two men sat in silence for several minutes, the only sound the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Finally Jake spoke. "Why do you think he does it? Why is Danny still out there?" Roy looked out the window at the dark highway beyond. "I think some people care so much about others that death cannot stop them from helping. Danny always said the road was his life. Maybe now the road is his afterlife too." Jake finished his coffee and stood to leave. As he reached the door, Roy called out to him. "Jake." When the trucker turned back, Roy continued, "If you ever drive that stretch again and hear that voice, just say thank you. I think he would appreciate knowing his warnings are still being heard." Over the next several weeks, Jake found himself thinking constantly about his encounter with Danny Cole, Beski's ghost. He researched the accidents Roy had mentioned and found newspaper articles confirming everything the clerk had told him. More disturbing still, he found online forums where truckers shared stories of supernatural encounters on the highway, and mile marker 26 on Interstate 80 came up again and again. Some drivers reported not just radio warnings, but actually seeing a blue Peterbilt in their mirrors, flashing its lights to warn of danger ahead, only to have the truck vanish when they looked again. Others described a figure standing by the roadside at the accident site, waving frantically to get their attention before disappearing. Jake began taking a different route to avoid Interstate 80 entirely, but eventually circumstances forced him back to that highway. It was nearly a year later when he found himself approaching mile marker 26 again, this time heading westbound. The memory of his first encounter came flooding back as he passed the spot where Donnie had died. This time there was no warning on the radio, no phantom voice cutting through the static. The road was clear and safe, but as Jake drove past the mile marker, he keyed his CB mic one final time. "Danny, if you're out there, thank you. Rest easy, driver. You have saved more lives than you know." For just a moment, Jake thought he heard something in the static that followed his transmission. It might have been interference from a distant radio station, or the wind across his antenna, or his imagination filling in the gaps of what he wanted to hear, but it sounded remarkably like a voice saying, "104, good buddy. Drive safe out there." Maria Santos thought she was just doing a good deed when she spotted the woman standing beside Highway 50 in the middle of a Colorado blizzard. After 18 years of driving long-haul freight across the American West, Maria had developed a sixth sense about when someone truly needed help, and everything about this situation screamed emergency. The woman was young, maybe early 20s, wearing nothing but a thin summer dress and sandals in weather that was rapidly approaching whiteout condition. It was just past midnight on February 14th, Valentine's Day, when Maria first caught sight of her in the amber glow of her headlight. The storm had been building for hours, transforming what should have been a routine run from Denver to Salt Lake City into a white-knuckled battle against nature. The National Weather Service had been broadcasting warnings all evening about a massive storm system moving through the Rockies with wind gusts up to 60 miles per hour and visibility dropping to near zero. Maria had been planning to stop at the next truck stop to wait out the worst of it, but when she saw the figure beside the road, she knew she could not drive past. No one could survive more than a few minutes in those conditions, dressed like that. She eased her 40-foot rig to a stop on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking, and roared down her passenger window. "Hey, you okay out there?" she called over the howling wind. The woman approached the truck slowly, and as she got closer, Maria got her first good look at her. She was pale, almost ghostly white, with long dark hair that hung in wet tangles around her face. Her lips were blue with cold, and she was shivering so violently that Maria could see it even through the swirling snow. "Please," the woman said, her voice barely audible above the storm. "I need to get to Silverton. My family is waiting for me." Maria frowned. Silverton was at least 200 miles south, deep in the San Juan Mountains, and in conditions like these, it would be suicide to attempt that drive. But looking at this woman so clearly in distress and so dangerously underdressed, Maria knew she could not leave her out here. "Come on up," Maria said, unlocking the passenger door. "We will figure something out." The woman climbed into the cab with superb agility, despite her obvious hypothermia. As soon as she settled into the passenger seat, Maria cranked up the heat and grabbed a spare blanket from behind her sleeping area. "What is your name, hon?" Maria asked, wrapping the blanket around the woman's shoulders. "What were you doing out there?" "Sarah," the woman replied, her teeth chattering. "Sarah Mackenzie. My car broke down about 5 meters back. I have been walking for hours." Maria studied Sarah's face in the dashboard lights. Something about her seemed off, though she could not quite put her finger on what it was. Maybe it was the way her skin seemed almost translucent, or how her eyes had a distant, unfocused quality. But people in the early stages of hypothermia could display strange symptoms, and Maria had seen enough medical emergencies on the road to know that getting this woman somewhere warm was the priority. "Silverton is not happening tonight," Maria said firmly, pulling back onto the highway. "This storm is supposed to get worse before it gets better. I'm going to take you to the next truck stop, get you warmed up properly, and we will call someone to come get you." Sarah nodded gratefully, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. "Thank you so much. I do not know what I would have done if you had not stopped." As they drove through the blizzard, Maria tried to make conversation to keep Sarah alert and conscious. She had been trained in basic first aid, and she knew that hypothermia victims could slip into unconsciousness without warning. "So what is in Silverton?" Maria asked. "Family. My parents," Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger as the cab warmed up. "They're expecting me for dinner. I promised I would be there on Valentine's Day." "That is sweet. Are you from there originally?" Sarah nodded, staring out at the swirling snow. "Born and raised. I moved to Denver for college, but I try to get home as often as I can. My parents worry when I do not visit regularly." They talked for nearly an hour as Maria navigated the treacherous highway. Sarah told her about growing up in the mountains, about how her father had taught her to ski when she was just 4 years old, about her mother's famous apple pie that the whole town would talk about. Her stories were vivid and detailed, filled with the kind of specific memories that could only come from someone who truly loved their hometown. But as they talked, Maria began to notice strange details. Sarah never seemed to get any warmth, despite the blanket and the heat blasting in the cab. Her skin remained that ghostly pale color, and when Maria glanced over at her, she sometimes seemed almost transparent in the dashboard lights. More disturbing still, Sarah never left any impression in the passenger seat, as if she weighed nothing at all. Tried to dismiss these observations as tricks of the light and her own fatigue. She had been driving for 12 hours straight, and winter storms played tricks on everyone's perception. But there was something else, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Every time Sarah spoke, her voice had a hollow quality, like it was coming from very far away. "There," Sarah said suddenly, pointing ahead through the snow. The truck stopped. Maria looked ahead and saw the familiar glow of a Love's Travel stop emerging from the blizzard. She had stopped here dozens of times over the years, and she knew they had a restaurant, showers, and a warm place where Sarah could recover while they figured out how to get her home. Perfect, Maria said, pulling into the parking lot. Let me just find a good spot to park, and we will get you inside. She maneuvered her rig into a parking space near the building and set the air brakes. When she turned to tell Sarah they had arrived, the passenger seat was empty. Maria blinked, certain that exhaustion was playing tricks on her eyes. She looked in the sleeper berth, thinking maybe Sarah had moved back there while she was concentrating on parking. Nothing. She checked the floor, thinking maybe the woman had collapsed. Still nothing. The blanket was still there, folded neatly on the passenger seat, but it was bone dry, despite having been wrapped around a woman who had been soaked to the skin just moments before. Maria picked it up with trembling hands, expecting it to be warm from body heat. It was ice cold. Sarah, Maria called out, her voice cracking with confusion and growing fear. Sarah, where did you go? She checked the door locks, still engaged. There was no way Sarah could have gotten out without Maria hearing the door open and close, especially not with the wind howling outside. But somehow she was gone. Maria sat in her cab for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. Maybe Sarah had slipped out while she was parking, though Maria could not imagine how she had missed it. Maybe the woman had been more disoriented than she had appeared, and she had wandered off into the storm. Whatever the explanation, Maria knew she needed to get help. She grabbed her jacket and ran through the blizzard. The truck stopped. Inside she found the night clerk, a heavy-set man named Dave, who she had chatted with on previous stops. Dave, I need your help, Maria said breathlessly. I just brought in a woman who was stranded in the storm, but she disappeared from my truck. We need to call the police, maybe get a search going before she freezes to death out there. Dave looked at her with concern. Slow down, Maria. What woman? I've been watching the cameras all night, and I saw you pull in alone. Maria stared at him. No, that is impossible. She was right there in my passenger seat. Young woman, early 20s, long dark hair, wearing a summer dress, said her name was Sarah Mackenzie. Dave's expression changed immediately, his face going pale. What did you say her name was? Sarah Mackenzie. She said she was from Silverton, trying to get home to see her parents. Dave walked around the counter and put a hand on Maria's shoulder. Maria, I think you should sit down. What are you talking about? We need to find her before she freezes to death. Maria Sarah Mackenzie died 15 years ago. Car accident on Highway 50, not 10 miles from where you said you picked her up. She was 22 years old, driving home from Denver to see her parents in Silverton. The words hit Maria like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, gripping the counter for support. That is impossible. I talked to her for over an hour. She told me about her childhood, her parents, specific details about Silverton. Dave nodded grimly. I have heard this story before. You are not the first trucker to pick up Sarah Mackenzie on Highway 50 during a storm. Happens maybe once every couple years. Always the same story. Young woman, summer dress, needs to get home to Silverton. Maria sank into one of the plastic chairs near the coffee station, her mind reeling, but she was so real. We had a whole conversation, but she was cold, shivering, wrapped in my blanket. The accident happened on February 14th, 2008, Dave continued quietly. Valentine's Day, just like tonight, Sarah was driving home to surprise her parents for the holiday, hit a patch of black ice during a blizzard. Car went off the road. They did not find her. until the spring thaw. Why? Maria whispered. Why does she keep appearing? Dave poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. I have thought about that a lot over the years. My theory is that she is still trying to get home, still trying to make that Valentine's Day dinner with her parents. Maybe she does not know she died, or maybe she just cannot accept it. Maria thought about the conversation she had had with Sarah, the vivid details about her childhood, the love in her voice. When she talked about her parents, she seemed so determined to get there, so worried about disappointing them. That is the thing about Sarah, Dave said. Everyone who picks her up says the same thing. She is not scary or threatening like some ghosts in the story. She is just a daughter, trying to get home to her family. They sat in silence for several minutes, the only sound the wind howling outside and the hum of the vending machines. Finally, Maria spoke. What happens to the people who pick her up? Were they cursed or something? Dave shook his head. Nothing bad happens to them. Sarah just needs a ride, and she is grateful to anyone who helps her. You did a good thing tonight, Maria. Maybe it does not make sense, but you helped a lost soul who has been trying to get home for 15 years. Maria remained at the truck stop until dawn, when the storm finally began to clear. She tried to make sense of what had happened, but every rational explanation crumbled under the weight of what she had experienced. Sarah had been as real as anyone she had ever met, solid and present, and undeniably there, yet she had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a dry blanket in a story that matched a tragedy from 15 years ago. As she prepared to resume her journey to Salt Lake City, Maria made a decision. She drove the 10-mile back to where she had picked up Sarah, stopping at the spot where Dave had said the accident occurred. There, partially hidden by snow and 15 years of weathering, she found a small roadside memorial, a white cross with Sarah Mackenzie's name, her birth and death dates, and a simple message, "Beloved daughter, forever in our hearts." Maria placed a small bouquet of artificial flowers beside the cross, flowers she had bought at the truck stop, gift shop. As she stood in the bright morning sunlight, the storm now just a memory, she spoke quietly to the memorial. I hope you make it home someday, Sarah. Your parents are still waiting for you. A gust of wind picked up the snow around the memorial, swirling it into a pattern that almost looked like a young woman in a summer dress, arms outstretched as if flagging down a ride. But when Maria blinked, there was nothing there but sunshine and clear mountain air. She never drove Highway 50 during a storm again without thinking about Sarah Mackenzie, the daughter who was still trying to get home for Valentine's Day dinner. And sometimes when other truckers shared stories about strange passengers who vanished without explanation, Maria would tell them about the young woman in the summer dress and remind them that sometimes the dead just need someone to care enough to offer them a ride. For 3 nights straight, Tom Richardson noticed the same car following him across state lines, always staying just far enough back to avoid being obvious, but close enough that its presence became impossible to ignore. After 22 years of hauling freight across the American heartland, Tom had developed an almost supernatural awareness of the vehicles around him. Every trucker did. Your life depended on knowing who was sharing the road with you, who was driving aggressively, and who might be a threat. But this was different. This felt personal. It started on a Tuesday night somewhere outside of Kansas City. Tom was heading west on Interstate 70, carrying a load of automotive parts bound for Denver. The traffic was light at 11 p.m. Just the usual mix of long-haul truckers and late-night travelers pushing through the darkness. That was when he first noticed the silver sedan in his mirrors. At first, there was nothing unusual about it, just another car maintaining a steady speed about a 4-mile behind him. But as the hours passed and the miles rolled by, Tom began to realize that every time he checked his mirrors, the sedan was still there. Same distance, Same position in the right lane, never passing, never falling back. When Tom pulled into a rest stop outside of Salina to check his load and grab some coffee, the sedan pulled in too, parking at the far end of the lot, with its headlights off. Tom watched from his cab as he filled out his logbook, but he could not see the driver clearly in the darkness, just a silhouette behind the wheel, seemingly waiting for something. Tom pulled back onto the highway 15 minutes later. The sedan followed within 2 minutes, resuming its position in his mirrors. By the time Tom reached the Colorado border, he had convinced himself it was just a coincidence. Maybe the driver was headed to Denver too, and was just using Tom's truck as a pace car to maintain a steady speed. It happened sometime. Four-wheelers would follow truckers for hours, letting the professional driver navigate the best lanes and maintain optimal speed. But when Tom stopped for his mandatory rest break at a truck stop in Lemon, Colorado, the sedan was there again, parked in the same corner of the lot, dark and silent. Tom managed to get a few hours of sleep, but when he woke at dawn to continue his run, his blood ran cold. There, scratched into the dirt on his passenger side door, was a message.
I know where you live. His hand shaking.
Watching his wife, while simultaneously following him across 3 states. This was not a random road rage incident, or a case of mistaken identity. This was targeted, organized, and deeply personal. He immediately called the police, but the Lyman Sheriff's Department was skeptical. "You sure this is not just some kind of prank?" the deputy asked, over the phone. "Maybe someone you know playing a joke." Tom tried to explain that no one in his life would think threatening his wife was funny, but the deputy seemed more interested in getting off the phone than investigating. "Well, if anything else happens, give us a call back," he said before hanging up. Frustrated and increasingly frightened, Tom called his dispatcher to report the incident. His company took the threat more seriously, offering to send another driver to complete the delivery, while Tom returned home to check on his wife. But Tom declined. He had a bad feeling that running home would only make things worse. If someone was watching both him and his house, leading them back to Janet might put her in more danger. Instead, Tom decided to complete his delivery and try to lose his stalker in the process. He took surface streets through Denver instead of the interstate, making random turns and stops, checking constantly to see if the silver sedan was still behind him. For a few hours, he thought he had succeeded. His mirror showed only normal traffic, no sign of his persistent shadow. But that night, as Tom began the long drive back to Missouri, the sedan reappeared. This time it was more aggressive. Instead of maintaining its usual distance, it followed closely, sometimes pulling alongside Tom's truck in the left lane. Kansas, Tom decided to confront whatever was happening. He parked near the main building, in full view of the security cameras, and waited. Sure enough, the sedan pulled into the lot and parked in its usual distant corner. This time, Tom did not wait in his cab. He walked directly toward the vehicle, his cell phone ready to call 911 at the first sign of trouble. But as he approached, the sedan suddenly roared to life and peeled out of the parking lot, tires squealing on the asphalt. Tom caught a glimpse of the license plate, but it was obscured by mud or tape, making it impossible to read. He reported the incident to the truck stop manager, who promised to review the security footage, but Tom knew it would be useless. His stalker was being careful, staying just on the edge of what could be prosecuted. The third night was when things escalated beyond psychological warfare. Tom was pushing hard to get home, driving through the night with only the legally mandated brake. He'd called Janet from the road, warning her to stay inside, keep the doors locked, and call the police. If she saw anyone suspicious around the house, she was frightened, but trying to stay strong, asking Tom to just come home safely. Around 3:00 a.m., Somewhere on a lonely stretch of Highway 54 in Missouri, Tom's truck began to shudder and slow down. The engine was running rough, losing power with every mile. He managed to pull onto the shoulder before the truck died completely. Steam was pouring from under the hood, and the temperature gauge was buried in the red zone. As Tom stepped out to assess the damage, his blood turned to ice. The silver sedan was parked about 50 yards behind him on the shoulder, headlights off. "Tom Richardson," the man called out, his voice carrying across the empty highway. "We need to talk." Tom's mind raced. His CB radio was in the cab, but he would have to turn his back on the approaching stranger to reach it. His cell phone was in his pocket, but he was in a dead zone with no signal. The nearest town was at least 10 miles away, and at this hour, traffic on this rural highway was virtually non-existent. "Who are you?" Tom called back, trying to keep his voice steady. "What do you want?" The man stopped about 20 feet away, close enough that Tom could see his face in the reflected light from the truck's emergency flashers. He was thin, pale, with hollow cheeks and dark circles under his eyes. There was something wrong with his expression, something that suggested he was not entirely rational. "He killed my brother," the man said matter-of-factly. 3 years ago. Interstate 44 outside of Rolla. You ran him off the road and kept driving." Tom's heart pounded as he tried to remember. 3 years ago. Interstate 44. A fatal accident. Suddenly, it came flooding back. He had been driving through a construction zone when a motorcycle had tried to pass him on the right, squeezing through a gap that was not really there. The bike had clipped his trailer and gone down, sliding under the wheels of a car behind them. Tom had pulled over immediately, calling 911 and staying until the police arrived. The investigation had cleared him of any wrongdoing. The motorcyclist had been legally intoxicated and driving recklessly through the construction zone. "I did not kill anyone," Tom said carefully. "The police investigated. It was ruled an accident. Your brother was drinking. He was speeding through a construction zone." "Liar," the man screamed, raising the knife. "You murdered him and got away with it, but I've been watching you, learning about you, planning this for months. Tonight, you pay." The man lunged forward, but Tom was ready. Years of loading and unloading freight had kept him in good shape, and adrenaline gave him speed he had not felt in decades. He dodged to the left and grabbed a tire iron from his truck's toolbox in one fluid motion. The two men faced each other in the eerie glow of the emergency lights. The only sounds, the idling of the sedan's engine and the distant hum of insects in the Missouri dark. "I am sorry about your brother," Tom said, holding the tire iron defensively. "I really am. But this is not going to bring him back. This is not what he would want. You do not know what he would want." The man snarled. "He was all I had left after our parents died. He was going to get clean, get married, start a family. You took all of that away." Tom could hear the pain in the man's voice, the years of grief and anger that had twisted into this moment of violence. He thought about Janet at home, waiting for him to call and tell her he was safe. He thought about the man's brother whose poor decisions had led to his death, but who had clearly been loved by someone. "What is your name?" Tom asked quietly. The question seemed to catch the man off guard. He hesitated, the knife wavering in his hand. "David. David Kowski." "David, I am truly sorry about your brother. I think about that night all the time. I wish I could have prevented what happened. But killing me is not going to fix anything. It is just going to create more pain for more people." For a moment, David's resolve seemed to crack. Tears were streaming down his face, and the knife was shaking in his grip. Tom could see the tormented young man underneath the vengeful stalker, someone who had been consumed by grief and rage until it had poisoned his entire life. He looked. The blade sliced across Tom's forearm, drawing blood and sending a shock of pain up to his shoulder. The two men grappled in the darkness, rolling across the gravel shoulder as cars finally began to appear on the distant horizon. A Missouri State Highway Patrol cruiser, running without lights, had been responding to an abandoned vehicle call when the troopers spotted the struggle beside the disabled truck. Within minutes, David was face down on the asphalt in handcuffs, still screaming about his brother and justice and revenge. Tom sat in the back of an ambulance as a paramedic stitched up his arm, watching as David was loaded into another patrol car. The young man had stopped struggling and was now just staring straight ahead, tears rolling down his cheeks in the red and blue glow of the police light. He had been planning this for months. The investigating trooper told Tom, "We found maps of your regular routes in his car, photographs of your house, your truck, even your wife. He had been studying your schedule, learning your habits. Tonight was not random. It was the culmination of an obsession. The trooper showed Tom David's car, which was filled with evidence of months stalking, bunch gas receipts from every city Tom had visited in the past 3 months, printouts of Tom's employer's website showing delivery schedules, even a detailed floor plan of Tom's house that David had apparently created by watching the property for weeks. How did he get my schedule?" Tom asked. "Social media," the trooper replied. "Your trucking company posts about delivery. Employees share photos from the road. He put together a profile of your movements just by following your company's online presence." As Tom was finally cleared to call a tow truck and arrange for a rental car to get home, sometimes late at night when he was driving through the darkness, Tom would wonder if David had found peace, if he had been able to let go of his anger and rebuild his life. But mostly, Tom tried not to think about those 3 nights when he had been hunted across the highways by someone who blamed him for a tragedy that was already written in the stars, long before their paths had crossed. The silver sedan was impounded as evidence, but Tom still found himself checking his mirrors more carefully than used to. Still felt a chill when he saw a car following the same route for too many miles. Some encounters on the road change you forever, and the knowledge that someone can watch you, study you, plan to hurt you while you go about your daily life, trying to make an honest living, that knowledge never entirely goes away. Every trucker knows that the highway can be a dangerous place, but most of the time the danger comes from accidents, weather, or mechanical failures. Tom learned that sometimes the greatest danger comes from the human heart, twisted by grief into something dark and vengeful, following you through the night with patience and determination that can span months or even years. He never drove Highway 54 through Missouri again. When dispatch told Sarah Collins that the cargo was classified and asked no question, she should have walked away from the job right then and there. But after 3 months of barely scraping together enough loads to make her truck payments, New Jersey, to a research laboratory in Atlanta, Georgia, the money was too good to refuse. Even if every instinct she had developed during her 8 years as an independent trucker was screaming at her to run, the pickup location was not a normal pharmaceutical warehouse. Instead of the bustling industrial complex Sarah had expected, she found herself at a nondescript concrete building surrounded by 12 chain-link fences topped with razor wire. There were no company signs, no loading docks visible from the street, just a single gate with an intercom system and security cameras positioned at every corner. When Sarah pressed the call button, a voice simply said, "State your business, Sarah Collins." Collins Independent Trucking. I am here for the Atlanta pickup. The gate swung open silently, and Sarah drove her refrigerated trailer into the compound. A man in a white lab coat was waiting for her, clipboard in hand, his expression serious, professional. What disturbed Sarah most was that he never introduced himself, never made small talk, never even looked her directly in the eyes. "You will need to sign this," he said, handing her a thick stack of papers. Non-disclosure agreement, cargo manifest, liability waiver, and delivery confirmation. Read everything carefully before you sign. Sarah had signed hundreds of shipping documents over the years, but these were different. The non-disclosure agreement was 15 pages long and contained language but about federal prosecution and criminal penalties for discussing the cargo with anyone, including law enforcement, without specific written authorization. The cargo manifest listed only biological specimens, temperature-controlled, handled with extreme care, no weights, no detailed descriptions, no shipper identification beyond a series of numbers and letters that meant nothing to her. "What exactly am I hauling?" Sarah asked, setting down the pen without signing. The man's expression hardened. "The documents explain everything you need to know. The cargo must maintain a temperature between 38 and 42 degrees at all times. Any deviation will result in complete loss of the shipment and full financial liability on your part. The trailer is not to be opened under any circumstances during transport. I need to know what I'm carrying," Sarah insisted. "For safety reasons, for legal reasons. I have a right to know what is in my trailer. Miss Collins, you have been pre-approved for this shipment based on your clean driving record and discretion regarding previous sensitive cargo. If you are not comfortable with the terms, we can terminate this contract right now and find another carrier." Sarah thought about her overdue mortgage payment, her truck payment that was due in 2 weeks, and the 3 job rejections she had received that morning alone. She picked up the pen and signed her name. The loading process was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. Instead of dock workers with forklifts, a team of technicians in full hazmat suits wheeled the cargo into her trailer using specialized equipment. She could see through the trailer's rear doors that there were 6 large rectangular containers, each about the size of a coffin, made of some kind of brushed metal with digital temperature displays and warning labels. She could not read from her distance. "Remember," the man in the lab coat said as the technicians sealed the trailer, "no stops except for fuel and legally mandated rest breaks. Direct route only. Do not deviate from the GPS coordinates we have programmed into your navigation system. Delivery must be completed within 18 hours. Sarah had made the Newark to Atlanta run dozens of times, and she knew it was a 12-hour drive under normal conditions. The 18-hour window gave some flexibility for breaks and traffic delays, but it also meant pushing harder than she normally would. As she pulled out of the facility, her refrigeration unit humming quietly behind her, Sarah tried to shake the feeling that she had just made a terrible mistake. For the first 3 hours, everything seemed normal. The cargo rode smoothly. The temperature gauge remained stable at 40 degrees, and her navigation system guided her along familiar interstate highways through New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and into Maryland. Sarah had transported pharmaceutical products before, and she told herself that this was probably just an extremely valuable batch of experimental medicines or research samples. The secrecy and security measures were unusual, but not unheard of in the pharmaceutical industry. It was just after midnight somewhere south of Baltimore when Sarah first heard the sound. She had stopped for fuel at a truck stop on I-95, and as she was checking her trailer's refrigeration unit, She heard what sounded like a low moan coming from inside the cargo area. Sarah froze, her hand still on the temperature gauge, and listened carefully. For a moment, there was nothing but the normal hum of the cooling system and the distant noise of highway traffic. Then she heard it again. A moan, definitely human, muffled but unmistakable. It was followed by what sounded like scratching, like fingernails against metal. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She walked around to the back of her trailer and put her ear against the doors. The sounds were clearer now, and there was no doubt in her mind about what she was hearing. Someone, or multiple someones, were alive inside those containers. The moaning was weak, desperate, and accompanied by the rhythmic sound of someone trying to claw their way out. Her first instinct was to call the police, but the non-disclosure agreement she had signed specifically prohibited contacting law enforcement without authorization. Her second thought was to open the trailer and see what was inside, but the contract made it clear that breaking the seal would result in criminal charges and financial ruin. Sarah stood in the truck stop parking lot, paralyzed by the realization that she might be transporting kidnapped people and that she had legally agreed to not do anything about it. She decided to call the emergency number she had been given for cargo problems. It rang once before a recorded message played. If you are calling about cargo irregularities, continue transport as directed. Any deviation from the delivery schedule will result in immediate contract termination and legal action. The line went dead. Sarah tried calling dispatch, but got only voicemail. She tried the main number for the company that had hired her, but it was disconnected. As she stood there in the fluorescent glow of the truck stop's overhead lights, Sarah began to understand that she was completely on her own, carrying cargo that was most likely human beings with no way to get help that would not destroy her life. She made the decision that would haunt her for the rest of her career. She got back in her truck and kept driving. Over the next 8 hours, the sounds from the trailer became increasingly disturbing. The moaning grew weaker, more desperate, and was joined by what Sarah could only describe as sobbing. There were voices, multiple people, some speaking in what sounded like foreign languages, others pleading in broken English. Please help us, she heard through the metal walls. We cannot breathe, so cold. Please somebody help us. Sarah cranked up her radio to try to drown out the sounds, but nothing could block them completely. Every time she stopped for fuel or a rest break, she could hear them more clearly. The scratching sounds became more frantic, and she realized that people were using their fingernails, maybe even their teeth, to try to claw through the metal containers. By dawn, somewhere in South Carolina, the sounds had changed again. The pleading had stopped. The scratching had stopped, and now there was just occasional moaning, weaker than before, in long periods of silence that were somehow worse than the noise had been. Sarah knew people were dying in her trailer, and she was delivering them to their deaths. She began to form a plan. When she reached the delivery location in Atlanta, she would find a way to alert authorities. She would claim that she had only discovered the cargo's true nature upon delivery, that she had been deceived by the shippers. She would face whatever legal consequences came, but she could not be complicit in what was clearly human trafficking on a massive scale. But as she pulled into the delivery location, Sarah realized that her plan was doomed from the start. The facility in Atlanta was identical to the one in Newark. Unmarked concrete building, razor wire fences, armed security guards, and no visible connection to the outside world. The men who met her truck were not the kind of people who would allow her to walk away with knowledge of their operation. Any problems during transport? One of them asked as Sarah climbed down from her cab. The refrigeration unit had some temperature fluctuations. Sarah lied. And I think I heard some settling noises from the cargo. The man's eyes narrowed. What kind of noises? Just some creaking, the container shifting around. Nothing major. Two technicians in hazmat suits began unsealing her trailer, while Sarah was directed into the building to complete paperwork. Through a window, she watched as they unloaded the 6 containers, and her heart sank as she realized that none of the containers were making any sound at all anymore. Whatever had been alive in there was silent now. The man who had questioned her about problems returned with her final paperwork and payment. "Miss Collins, you have done excellent work on this delivery. Clean, professional, discreet. We will definitely be in touch for future shipments." Sarah signed the delivery confirmation with trembling hands, accepted her payment, and walked back to her truck as quickly as she could without running. As she pulled out of the facility, she caught a glimpse of the containers being wheeled into the building. One of them had long scratch marks on the outside, gouged deep into the metal by someone desperately trying to escape. Over the following weeks, Sarah waited for news reports about missing people, about the discovery of bodies, arrests connected to the facilities she had delivered to and picked up from. Nothing appeared in the news. She searched online for any mention of the addresses she had visited, but found nothing. It was as if the entire operation existed outside of normal society, invisible to law enforcement and media alike. Sarah never took another classified cargo job, but the damage was already done. She could not sleep without hearing the voices from her trailer. She could not drive past a refrigerated truck without wondering what might be inside. The money she had earned from that delivery was supposed to solve her financial problems, but she found herself unable to spend it, as if it were contaminated with the blood of the people she had failed to save. 3 months later, she hung up immediately and changed her phone number the next day. She sold her truck and trailer 6 months after that, using the money to buy a small house from any major highways. She never drove professionally again, but sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind is blowing just right, Sarah swears she can still hear the voices from that trailer. "Please help us," they whisper. "We cannot breathe, so cold. Please, somebody help us." She never found out who those people were, where they had come from, or what had happened to their bodies after she delivered them, but she knows that somewhere in the dark network of human trafficking that operates invisible to most of society, there are people who remember Sarah Collins as the driver who heard their final pleas for help and chose to keep driving. She knows that in their last moments, as they realized that no rescue was coming, those people heard the sound of her truck's engine carrying them toward their death. But she knows the truth. It is blood money, payment for services that no human being should ever provide. And every month when she receives her bank statement and sees that balance, she remembers the choice she made on that highway in South Carolina, when she decided that her own financial survival was more important than the lives of strangers locked in metal coffins behind her. Sarah never learned their names, never saw their faces, never knew their stories, but she carried them to their graves, and that knowledge follows her wherever she goes. A cargo she can never deliver, never unload, never leave behind at some distant facility. It rides with her always, a weight heavier than any trailer she ever pulled, a sound more persistent than any engine she ever heard. The screaming has stopped, but the silence is worse. After taking a wrong turn in Montana, Rick Sullivan found himself in a town that did not exist on any map, where the clocks ran backward and the people moved like they were trapped in a film played in reverse. What started as a simple navigation error on a routine haul from Billings to Seattle turned into 3 hours of pure terror that Rick would spend the rest of his life trying to forget. It was October 13th, a Friday, when Rick's GPS system began acting strangely somewhere near the Little Belt Mountain. He had been driving professionally for 11 years and knew Montana's highways like the back of his weathered hands, but the device kept insisting he take an exit that he was certain did not exist. The screen showed a clear off-ramp leading to State Route 91, but when Rick looked out his windshield, all he saw was dense forest and rocky terrain. Damn thing must be glitching again, Rick muttered, reaching over to reset the GPS. But as he rounded a curve in the road, there it was, an off-ramp that definitely had not been there on his previous runs through this area. The sign read Millfield, population 2080-47, welcome visitors in that familiar green reflective lettering, but something about it felt wrong. The paint was too bright, too new, as if someone had just installed it moments before his arrival. Rick's first instinct was to keep driving, but his fuel gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty, and the next confirmed truck stop was still 70 miles ahead. Millfield would have to do, even if it meant dealing with small-town gas prices and curious locals who did not see many 18-wheelers. The road into town was smooth asphalt, freshly paved, winding through what appeared to be a perfectly preserved example of 1950s Americana. White picket fences lined the streets. American flags hung motionless from every porch, and vintage automobiles sat in driveways like museum pieces. But as Rick navigated his truck through the narrow streets, he began to notice details that made his skin crawl. Every clock visible through store windows showed a different time, and none of them matched his dashboard chronometer. More disturbing still, the hands on several clocks appeared to be moving counterclockwise, ticking backward through the hours, as if time itself were unwinding. Rick rubbed his eyes, certain that fatigue was playing tricks on his vision. But the impossible clockwork continued its reverse dance. The gas station on Main Street looked like something from a Norman Rockwell painting, complete with full-service pumps and an attendant in coveralls, who approached Rick's truck with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Fill her up," the man asked, his voice carrying an odd echo, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. "Just diesel," Rick replied, stepping down from his cab to stretch his legs. "In maybe directions back to Highway 12. My GPS seems to be confused." The attendant's smile widened, showing teeth that were too white and too uniform. "Oh, you do not want to leave Millfield, friend. We have everything you need right here. Best coffee in 3 counties, home-cooked meals, clean beds. Why would you want to go anywhere else?" As the attendant filled his tank, Rick walked around the corner of the station to use the restroom. What he saw there made him question his own sanity. A woman was walking backward down the sidewalk, her steps perfectly coordinated, but moving in reverse, as if someone had filmed her normal walking and was now playing the footage in the wrong direction. She was carrying groceries, and as Rick watched, in fascination and growing horror, she backed into a store, the automatic doors opening to accommodate her strange locomotion. Rick blinked hard and looked again, but the woman was gone. Each bounce seemed to precede the throw, as if cause and effect had been reversed. "Excuse me, son," Rick called out, approaching the child. "Are you okay? Is your family around?" The boy looked up at Rick with eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone so young. When he spoke, his voice sounded like an old recording played at the wrong speed. "Time moves differently here, miss. Some folk come to visit. Some folks stay forever. Depends on how long you linger." Before Rick could ask what that meant, the boy turned and walked away, his footsteps making no sound on the concrete sidewalk. Rick watched him disappear around a corner, then immediately followed. But when he reached the intersection, There was no sign of the child anywhere. The fuel gauge on Rick's truck read full when he returned to pay the attendant, but according to his trip odometer, he had only been in Millfield for 10 minutes. The man said. Rick looked at the receipt and froze. The date stamp read October 13th. Per gallon, and at the bottom of the slip, handwritten in faded ink, were the words, "Thank you for visiting Millfield, where yesterday is tomorrow." "There has got to be some mistake," Rick said, pulling out his wallet. "This receipt shows the wrong year." The attendant's smile faltered for just a moment, and Rick caught a glimpse of something behind those two perfect teeth. Darkness, vast and empty, like looking into a well at midnight. "No mistake, friend. Time is what you make of it. You planning to stay for dinner? The cafe serves the best pot roast this side of eternity." Rick shook his head and backed toward his truck, every instinct screaming at him to leave immediately. But as he climbed into his cab and started the engine, he realized he could not remember which direction he had come from. The streets of Millfield seemed to rearrange themselves when he was not looking directly at them, and his GPS screen showed only static. He drove randomly through the residential neighborhoods, hoping to find the road that had brought him into town. But every street led back to Main Street. Every turn brought him past the same white houses and perfect lawns. The sun, which had been high overhead when he arrived, was now casting long shadows, but the shadows were pointing in the wrong direction, as if the light were coming from the west instead of the east. At a stop sign, Rick noticed a mailman delivering letters, but the man was walking backward, removing mail from mailboxes instead of putting it in. A group of children were playing in a yard, but their laughter sounded wrong, like audio being played in reverse, all consonants and twisted vowels that hurt to hear. Panic began to set in as Rick realized he had been driving in circles for over an hour. His fuel gauge, which had read full after the fill-up, now showed 3/4 empty, as if the truck were consuming gas at an impossible rate. More troubling still, his dashboard clock was running backward, the digital display counting down instead of up. At the town square, Rick parked his truck and got out to ask for direction, but every person he approached would smile that same unsettling smile and suggest he stay for dinner, stay overnight, stay as long as he liked. A woman in a 1950s style dress approached him with a plate of cookies that steamed as if they had just come from the oven. "You look tired, dear," she said in a voice like honey poured over broken glass. "Why not come inside and rest? We have a lovely guest room, very quiet, very comfortable. You could stay for years, and it would feel like minutes." Rick looked into her eyes and saw the same darkness he had glimpsed behind the gas station attendant's teeth. These were not people. He realized there was something else. Logic. The houses blurred past his windows, but they were all identical now, perfect copies of each other, as if the town were revealing its artificial nature. Finally, as the backward sun began to set in the wrong part of the sky, Rick saw something that filled him with hope. Tire tracks in the asphalt, 18-wheeler tire tracks that could only have been made by his own truck. He followed them like a bloodhound, even as the tracks seemed to fade and reappear according to some pattern he could not understand. The tracks led him to a road he had not noticed before, a narrow lane that wound uphill through the trees. As he drove, the impossible architecture of Millfield fell away behind him, and suddenly he was back on Highway 12, his GPS system beeping back to life, as if nothing had happened. Rick pulled over at the first rest stop he found and checked his logbook. According to his records, he had lost exactly 3 hours, but his truck's odometer showed he had driven less than 5 miles. His fuel gauge read exactly what it had before he took the exit, to Millfield, as if he had never stopped for gas at all. The receipt from the gas station was gone from his wallet, and when he tried to backtrack to find the exit again, it simply was not there. No off-ramp, no signs for Millfield, nothing but unbroken forest, stretching for miles along the highway. Rick completed his run to Seattle, but he spent the entire drive researching Millfield, Montana, on every trucking form and local history website he could find. There were no records of such a town, no mention of it in state databases, no population statistics or municipal listings. It was as if Millfield existed only when someone was lost enough, desperate enough, or unlucky enough to need it. 6 months later, Rick was driving the same route when he met another trucker at a fuel stop in Great Falls. The man looked haggarded, his eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes from seeing something that should not exist. "You ever heard of a place called Millfield?" the trucker asked. "Strangest damn thing. GPS led me to this town that was not on any map, where all the clocks ran backward and the people moved like they were in some kind of reversed movie." Rick bought the man a cup of coffee and listened to a story that matched his own experience down to the smallest detail. The gas station attendant with the too white smile, the children playing impossible games, the way time seemed to fold in on itself like origami made for minutes and hours. "Did you try to go back and find it?" Rick asked. The trucker shook his head. "Road was not there anymore, like it never existed. But I keep thinking about what that little boy told me about how some folks visit and some folks stay forever. Makes me wonder how many truckers have taken that exit over the years and just never came back." Rick never drove through that part of Montana again, always taking alternate routes that added hours to his trips, but kept him far from the Little Belt Mountains. But sometimes, late at night, when he was fighting fatigue and his GPS started acting strangely, he would remember the backwoods town where time moved like molasses in winter, and the people wore human faces like masks. He would remember the gas station attendant's invitation to stay for dinner, and the woman with the fresh cookies who promised a rest that would feel like minutes but last for years. He would remember the darkness behind their smiles and wonder if Phil was still out there, waiting patiently for the next lost traveler who needed gas and made the mistake of trusting technology over instinct. Rick never found out what Millfield really was or why it existed, but he knew one thing for certain: some exits should never be taken, no matter how empty your tank or how confused your GPS. Some towns exist outside of time and space, in the cracks between what is and what should be, feeding on the hours and days of anyone foolish enough to accept their hospitality. And somewhere in Montana, on a stretch of highway that maps insist is empty wilderness, there might still be an exit sign that was not there yesterday, pointing toward a town where the clocks run backward and visitors are always welcome to stay as long as they like, forever. The mandatory way station inspection should have been routine for Marcus Thompson, but the officers were not checking for overweight loads. They were checking for something far more sinister. And by the time Marcus realized what was happening, it was almost too late to escape the organized nightmare that masqueraded as a legitimate Department of Transportation facility. Marcus had been hauling freight for 16 years, and he thought he had seen every type of corruption the road could offer. Crooked inspectors who demanded cash to overlook minor violations, local cops who targeted out-of-state truckers for manufactured infractions, even station attendants who would tip
of their friends about which drivers were carrying valuable cargo. But nothing had prepared him for what he would discover at milepost 127 on Interstate 40 in eastern New Mexico, where a perfectly legal government facility was being used as a front for human trafficking on an industrial scale. It was 3:30 in the morning when Marcus saw the electronic sign commanding all commercial vehicles to report to the way station ahead. He had been driving through the night hauling electronics from Los Angeles to Dallas,
fighting to stay on schedule after 6-hour delay in Phoenix. The way station appeared normal. From a distance, standard concrete building scales embedded in the roadway, official New Mexico Department of Transportation signage, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. But as Marcus pulled his 40-foot trailer onto the scales, he noticed details that made his veteran trucker instincts twinge with unease. There were too many officials for a routine night shift, at least 8 men in 2 uniforms, moving around the facility with military precision. More disturbing still, there were 3 other trucks already parked in the inspection bays, their drivers nowhere to be seen, and none of the vehicles appeared to be undergoing normal safety inspection. A heavy-set man in an inspector's uniform approached Marcus's cab, clipboard in hand, badge gleaming under the overhead lights. Evening driver. Need to see your logbook, bill of lighting, and do medical card. Also going to need you to step out for a mandatory inspection. Marcus handed over his paperwork through the window, but something about the inspector's demeanor felt wrong. His badge looked authentic, his uniform was regulation, but his eyes had a predatory quality that Marcus had learned to recognize after years of dealing with people who viewed truckers as easy marks. Everything seems to be in order, the inspector said, barely glancing at the documents, but we have had reports of smuggling activity on this route. So, we're going to need to do a comprehensive cargo inspection. Going to have to ask you to come inside while we check your load. Marcus had been through thousands of inspections over his career, and he knew this was not standard procedure. Cargo inspections were conducted at the truck, not inside the building, and drivers were typically allowed to observe the entire process. But the inspector's tone made it clear this was not a request. "Look, officer, I'm on a tight schedule," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice respectful but firm. "My load is sealed electronics. Nothing that would interest smuggling operations. Can we just do a quick visual inspection and get me back on the road?" The inspector's expression hardened. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of that cab right now and accompany me inside. Failure to comply with a DOT inspection is a federal offense that can result in immediate license suspension." Marcus knew when he was caught between a rock and a hard place, he could refuse and face the legal consequences of interfering with a government inspection, or he could comply and hope this was just an overzealous night shift looking to justify their existence. He chose compliance, but as he followed the inspector toward the building, he noticed one of the other officials photographing his license plate and making notes about his truck. Inside the way station building, Marcus immediately knew he had made a terrible mistake. The facility looked like a standard government office from the outside, but the interior had been modified in ways that had nothing to do with vehicle inspection. Heavy curtains covered all the windows. Electronic jamming equipment hummed quietly in the corners, and there were holding cells where there should have been administrative offices. "Welcome to our special inspection facility," the heavy-set inspector said, his professional demeanor evaporating to reveal something cold and calculating underneath. "We conduct very thorough examinations here, Mr. Thompson." Very thorough. Indeed, Marcus realized that the other truck drivers he had seen were not absent from their vehicles by choice. They were being held somewhere in this building, and whatever was happening to them was not part of any legitimate government operation. "I want to call my dispatcher," Marcus said, reaching for his cell phone. "This does not feel like a standard DOT procedure." 2 more men in official uniforms appeared from a back room, and Marcus noticed they were wearing sidearms, the typical equipment for vehicle inspectors. One of them, a tall man with military bearing and dead eyes, stepped forward with a smile that never touched his face. "Mr. Thompson, You are not going to be making any phone calls tonight. See, we have been watching your routes, studying your habits, learning about your family back in Tulsa. Nice wife. Patricia works at the bank downtown, drives a blue Honda to work every morning at 8:15 sharp. Marcus's blood turned to ice. These people had been surveilling him, learning about his life, planning this encounter. This was not random law enforcement overreach. This was targeted, organized, and deeply criminal. What do you want? Marcus asked, trying to calculate his chances of fighting his way out of the building. What we want, Mr. Thompson, is your cooperation. You see, we have a very profitable business operation here, and we are always in need of reliable transportation, drivers with clean records, established routes, and the kind of reputation that does not attract unwanted attention from real law enforcement. The tall man gestured toward a large map on the wall, covered with pins and route marking. Marcus could see truck routes traced in red lines connecting major cities across the Southwest with notation about schedules, cargo capacities, and driver profiles. We have been very impressed with your punctuality, your clean inspection history, and your tendency to drive alone without co-drivers. These qualities make you an ideal candidate for our special cargo delivery. Marcus understood now what he was looking at. This was not just a corrupt way station operation. This was a recruitment center for human trafficking, using legitimate government facilities to identify and coerce truck drivers into becoming unwilling participants in organized crime. I'm not hauling anything illegal, Marcus said firmly, and threatening my wife is not going to change that. The smile on the tall man's face widened. Oh, Mr. Thompson, I think you misunderstand the situation. You are not being asked to volunteer. You are being conscripted, and if you refuse, well, Patricia's morning commute might become very dangerous indeed. That was when Marcus heard the voices from the back of the building. Muffled cries, people speaking in what sounded like Spanish, and possibly other language. The sound of many people crowded into a confined space. This facility was not just recruiting drivers, it was holding victims, using the way station as a transit point in a larger trafficking network. Marcus realized he had two choices: become complicit in human trafficking, or find a way to escape and expose this operation. The first option was morally unacceptable. The second option would require surviving long enough to reach real law enforcement. I need to use the restroom, Marcus said, playing for time. Of course, the tall man replied, nodding to one of his subordinates. Rodriguez will escort you, and Mr. Tom, please do not try anything heroic. We have invested considerable effort in studying you, and we would hate to have to make alternate arrangements for both you and your wife. Rodriguez led Marcus down a hallway toward what appeared to be a legitimate restroom, but as they passed a partially open door, Marcus caught a glimpse inside that confirmed his worst fears. At least 20 people, mostly young women and teenagers, were crowded into what had once been a conference room. They were sitting on bare mattresses, their faces showing the hollow desperation of people who had been held captive for extended periods. One of the women looked up and made brief eye contact with Marcus. She was young, maybe 19, with dark hair and eyes that held both fear and a desperate plea for help. In that instant, Marcus knew that running away and saving his own life was not an option. These people needed someone to know they existed, someone to care enough to risk everything to help them. In the restroom, Marcus noticed that the small window had been painted over, but the paint was old and starting to peel. He could see through gaps to the parking lot outside where his truck sat under the harsh light. If he could create a distraction, he might be able to reach his vehicle and use his CB radio to call for help. When Rodriguez escorted him back to the main room, Marcus made his decision. As they passed the room full of captives, he deliberately stumbled and fell against the door, pushing it open wider. "Help us!" Several voices cried out in English and Spanish. "Por favor, ordenos." Rodriguez immediately moved to close the door, but Marcus had already seen enough to understand the full scope of the operation. The room was set up like a temporary detention facility, with basic sanitation facilities, food containers, and sleeping areas for dozens of people. This was not a simple trafficking way station. This was a major hub where victims were processed, sorted, and prepared for transport to their final destinations. "Very unfortunate, Mr. Thompson," the tall man said when they returned to the main office. "Now you have seen things that make your cooperation not just preferable, absolutely essential. We cannot allow you to leave here with that information." Marcus knew his window for escape was closing rapidly. In a few minutes, these people would either force him to participate in their operation or eliminate him as a potential witness. He needed to act immediately while they still saw him as a potential asset rather than a definite threat. "All right," Marcus said, letting defeat creep into his voice. "What do you need me to do?" The tall man's expression shifted to satisfaction. "Excellent choice, Mr. Thompson. Your first delivery will be taking 15 passengers to a facility in Houston. They will be loaded into your trailer, which we will modify with basic life support and comfort amenities. The drive will take approximately 8 hours, during which you will maintain normal speed and follow all traffic laws." Marcus nodded, as if accepting the assignment, but his mind was racing. If he could get back to his truck, he might be able to use the CB radio to broadcast a distress call before they realized what he was doing. Even if he could not escape, he could at least alert other truckers to avoid this location. "I need to check my logbook," Marcus said. "Make sure I have enough driving hours left for the Houston run." "Of course," the tall man replied, relaxing slightly now that he believed Marcus was cooperating. "Rodriguez will escort you to your vehicle." As they walked toward his truck, Marcus noticed that the other vehicles in the inspection bays were being modified by what appeared to be a professional crew. False walls were being installed in the trailers, creating hidden compartments large enough to hold human beings. Ventilation systems were being added along with basic sanitation facilities and restraint mechanisms. At his truck, Marcus reached for his logbook, while simultaneously powering up his CB radio. As Rodriguez watched him flip through the page, Marcus keyed the mic and began broadcasting on Channel 19, the emergency frequency monitored by law enforcement and professional drivers. "Mayday, Mayday, this is driver Marcus Thompson at the eastbound way station on I-40 at milepost 137 in New Mexico. This facility is being used for human trafficking. Repeat. The way station at milepost 137 is holding kidnapped people. I need immediate law enforcement assistance. They are forcing drivers to transport victims. Do not stop at this location. Do not stop at this location." Rodriguez realized what was happening and lunged for the radio, but Marcus had already released the mic and was running toward the highway. Behind him, he could hear shouting and the sound of multiple vehicles starting up. Marcus ran through the darkness, staying close to the interstate shoulder, where passing traffic might see him. Several cars passed without stopping, but finally, a Colorado State Patrol cruiser running southbound spotted his frantic waving and pulled over. Within an hour, the way station was surrounded by federal agents, state police, and county sheriff's deputies. The investigation revealed that the facility had been compromised for over 2 years. Corrupt officials using legitimate government authority to facilitate one of the largest human trafficking operations ever discovered in the southwestern United States. 23 victims were rescued that night, including the young woman whose desperate eyes had convinced Marcus to risk everything. The operation had been transporting an estimated 50 people per month through the facility, generating millions of dollars in revenue for a network that extended from Mexico to Canada. Marcus learned later that the tall man was actually a former Department of Homeland Security agent who had been dismissed for corruption 3 years earlier. He and his associates had been using their knowledge of law enforcement procedures and their remaining contacts within various agencies to create an almost perfect front for their criminal enterprise. The official investigation revealed that at least 17 truck drivers had been coerced into participating in the trafficking network over the previous 2 years. Most had been threatened with violence against their families, but some had simply disappeared after refusing to cooperate. Their trucks were found abandoned in various locations, but the drivers themselves were never located. Marcus testified at the trial of 12 defendants, including 4 current and former law enforcement officials who had been providing protection for the operation. All defendants were convicted on federal human trafficking charges, with sentences ranging from 15 years to life in prison. But the experience changed Marcus forever. He could not drive past the station without remembering the sound of desperate voices calling for help, could not see a government inspector without wondering if they were who they appeared to be. Most troubling of all, he could not forget that there might be other facilities like the one at milepost 27, other corrupt officials using their authority to facilitate unimaginable crimes. Patricia stood by him through the long investigation and trial, but their marriage never fully recovered from the months of fear and uncertainty that
followed that night. The knowledge that criminals had studied their daily routines, learned about their lives, and planned to use that information to control them left both of them feeling violated and vulnerable in ways they had never experienced. Marcus continued driving professionally for 2 more years, but eventually decided that life on the road held too many dangers he had never considered. He now works as a safety instructor for a trucking company, teaching new drivers about the realities of corruption and exploitation
that exist in the shadows of legitimate law enforcement. Sometimes late at night, Marcus still wakes up hearing the voices of those 23 people who were rescued because one truck driver decided that some things are worth risking everything for. But Marcus sometimes wonders how many other drivers have taken that exit in the years since, expecting a routine inspection and finding themselves face to face with evil wearing a badge. David Chen had driven the Interstate 84 route from Portland to Salt Lake City hundreds of times over his 14 years as a professional trucker, but tonight he kept passing the same mile marker every 15 minutes, trapped in what seemed like an impossible stretch of highway that folded back on itself like a nightmare made of asphalt and painted lines. It started just after midnight on what should have been a routine haul, carrying computer equipment from Oregon to Utah. David had been making good time despite the October weather, pushing through light rain and occasional patches of fog that rolled across the Columbia River Gorge. He knew every curve, every grade, every truck stop along this route, which is why he immediately noticed when something went terribly wrong near mile marker 70. The first time David passed the marker, he barely registered it. Mile marker 73 was nothing special, just another small green sign reflecting his headlights on a lonely stretch of highway east of the Dow. But 15 minutes later, when his headlights illuminated the exact same sign again, David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night air. He checked his odometer and GPS, both of which confirmed he had been traveling steadily eastbound at 65 mph. According to his instrument, he should be approaching mile marker 89 by now, not seeing 73 again. David slowed down and studied the surrounding landscape more carefully. The same rock formation on his right, the same stands of pine trees on his left, the same slight curve in the road that led to the marker. GPS must be glitching, David muttered, tapping the screen of his navigation system. But the device showed his position. She could see its eyes reflecting her headlights, tracking her movement, and she had the distinct impression that it was memorizing her truck, studying the vehicle that had defeated its attempts to reach the human inside. As Jennifer drove past the spot where the creature had first appeared, she looked in her mirrors and saw something that made her press the accelerator harder. The creature was following her truck, running parallel to the highway through the trees, keeping pace with her vehicle, even as she accelerated to 60 miles per hour. Whatever this thing was, it was fast enough and persistent enough to track vehicles for extended distances. Jennifer maintained radio contact with other truckers as she continued north toward Atlanta, describing her encounter and warning them to be alert for unusual animal activity near mile marker 67. Several drivers reported that they had heard strange howling sounds from the forest along that stretch of highway, but none had seen the creature itself. It was not until she reached the truck stop in Cordell, 30 miles north of her encounter, that Jennifer felt safe enough to stop. As she parked under the bright lights of the fuel island, she noticed scratches on her truck's hood and doors where the creature had tested its grip on the metal. The marks were deep enough to have been made by claws or extremely strong fingernails, and they were positioned at heights that confirmed the creature's impossible size. Jennifer reported her encounter to the Georgia State Patrol, but the response was skeptical at best. The dispatcher took her information politely, but made it clear that reports of large unknown animals were not a high priority for law enforcement. She was advised to file a report with the Department of Natural Resources if she wanted to pursue the matter further over the same battle, and the echoes of their struggles would continue until they too discovered that the way out is sometimes the way through. What Jennifer Walsh saw crossing Interstate 95 that night was not any animal she had ever encountered in her 20 years of professional driving, and the way it moved through the darkness of rural Georgia defied every natural law she understood about how living creatures were supposed to exist in the world. Just past 2:11 a.m. on a moonless October night, when Jennifer first spotted the creature, she had been hauling auto parts from Jacksonville to Atlanta, making good time through the long stretches of pine forest and farmland that lined the interstate between Valdosta and Tiffin. The highway was nearly empty at that hour, just the occasional southbound truck heading toward Florida and the distant glow of her own headlights cutting through the thick darkness. Or two, Jennifer had always prided herself on being a no-nonsense driver who did not believe in ghost stories or supernatural nonsense. She had heard all the trucker tales over her 2 decades on the road: phantom hitchhikers, UFO sightings, mysterious voices on the CB radio, and she had always dismissed them as the products of fatigue, isolation, and too much caffeine. But what crossed her headlight beams near mile marker 67 would change her perspective on what was possible in the dark spaces between civilization. At first, Jennifer thought it was a deer. Something large and dark moved from the tree on the right side of the highway, heading toward the median strip with that characteristic bounding gait of a startled animal. She eased off the accelerator, as any experienced driver would when wildlife appeared on the roadway. Deer could turtle a truck if they collided at highway speeds, and Jennifer had no interest in explaining a wildlife accident to her dispatcher. But as the creature reached the center of her headlight beams, Jennifer realized this was no deer. The thing stood upright on 2 legs, easily 8 feet tall, covered in coarse dark hair that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its arms were disproportionately long, hanging almost to its knees, and its shoulders were broad enough to fill both lanes of traffic. But what made Jennifer's blood freeze was the face that turned toward her truck as she approached. It was almost human, but wrong, in ways that made her brain struggle to process what she was seeing. The features were too sharp, the eyes too large, and reflective, like an animal's eyes caught in headlights. but with an intelligence behind them that no animal should possess. When the creature looked directly at her through the windshield, Jennifer felt a primal terror that came from somewhere deeper than rational thought, a kind of fear that had kept human beings alive for millennia when they encountered predators in the dark. The creature did not run when it saw her truck approaching. Instead, it stood its ground in the middle of the interstate, studying her vehicle with obvious curiosity. Jennifer hit her brakes, bringing the 40-ton rig to a controlled stop, about 50 yards from where the thing waited. For several seconds, they regarded each other across the distance, woman and machine facing something that should not have existed. Then the creature began to move toward her truck. It did not walk the way humans walk, with alternating steps and natural rhythm. Instead, it seemed to glide across the asphalt with an unnaturally smooth gait, covering ground faster than anything that size should have been able to move. Jennifer watched in fascination and growing horror as the creature approached her driver's side window, moving with predatory grace that reminded her of a big cat stalking prey. When it reached the side of her cab, the creature placed one massive hand against the door just below the window, and Jennifer could see the individual fingers, each one ending in what appeared to be a curved claw. The hand was easily twice the size of a human hand, covered in the same dark hair, the rest of the creature's body, but the palm and fingertips looked surprisingly human-like. The creature's face appeared at her window, and Jennifer found herself staring into eyes that seemed to hold far too much intelligence for any wild animal. They were dark brown, almost black, with an awareness that made it clear this thing was studying her as intently as she was studying it. The creature tilted its head slightly, like a dog trying to understand a new sound, and Jennifer could see that its ears were pointed and mobile, swiveling to track sounds from the forest around them for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. Woman and creature examined each other through the glass. Jennifer was afraid to move, afraid to breathe, certain that any sudden action might trigger some kind of aggressive response. The creature's breath fogged the window slightly, and she could smell something wild and musky, like wet earth and decaying leaves. Then the creature did something that shattered Jennifer's understanding of what she was dealing with. It raised its free hand and tapped gently on the window with one claw. 3 deliberate knocks that sounded almost polite. The gesture was so human-like, so obviously intentional that Jennifer gasped audibly. The sound of her voice seemed to startle the creature, and it stepped back from the truck, looking around as if suddenly aware of its exposed position on the highway. Jennifer could see its muscles tensing, preparing for flight, and she made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her driving career. She reached for her cell phone to take a photograph. The moment her hand moved toward the phone, the creature's demeanor changed completely. What had been curiosity and apparent harmlessness transformed into something predatory and threatening. The creature's lips pulled back to reveal teeth that were definitely not herbivorous, long, sharp canines that gleamed in the reflected light from her headlights. A sound came from the creature's throat that Jennifer would later describe the most terrifying noise she had ever heard. It was part howl, part roar, and part something else entirely, a vocalization that seemed designed to paralyze prey through pure auditory terror. The sound was so loud and so alien that Jennifer felt it in her bones, a vibration that made her truck's windows rattle. The creature began circling her truck, moving with that same unnatural gliding motion, but now there was obvious aggression in its posture. It kept its eyes locked on Jennifer through the cab windows, and she could see intelligence in those dark orbs that was calculating, evaluating, planning. This was not a dumb animal acting on instinct. This was something that was actively deciding what to do about the human in the metal box. Jennifer's hands shook as she reached for her CB radio. Mayday, Mayday, this is northbound trucker at mile marker 67 on I-95. I have encountered some kind of animal on the highway. Large, aggressive, blocking traffic, need immediate assistance. The response came immediately from another trucker, then somewhere ahead of her position. Northbound driver, this is southbound at marker 71. What kind of animal are you dealing with? There, dear. Jennifer looked out her window at the creature, which was now standing directly in front of her truck, staring at her through the windshield. I honestly do not know what it is. It is about 8 feet tall, walks on 2 legs covered in dark hair. It is not running away from the truck like a normal animal would. Static filled the radio for several seconds before the other driver responded. Come again, northbound. Did you say 8 feet tall and walking upright? That is affirmative. This thing is not natural. It is studying my truck like it is trying to figure out how to get inside. As if responding to her words, the creature moved to the front of her truck and placed both hands on the hood. Jennifer could feel the vehicle rock slightly under the creature's weight and strength. Through the windshield, she was close enough to see details that made her stomach lurch with primal fear. The creature's face was a nightmare fusion of human and animal features. Its nose was flat and broad like an ape's, but its cheekbones and jaw structure were more human-like. Its eyes held an intelligence that was unmistakably aware, unmistakably calculating. This thing was not just examining her truck out of curiosity. It was problem-solving, trying to determine how to reach the human inside the metal shell. The creature began testing different parts of the truck systematically. It pulled on the door handles, pushed against the window, even tried to climb up onto the hood to reach the windshield. Each action was deliberate and methodical, the behavior of something that had encountered human technology before and understood that these metal containers held prey inside them. Jennifer realized with growing horror that this creature had probably done this before. Somewhere in the forests of Georgia, there might be other vehicles that had been forced to stop, other drivers who had encountered this thing in the darkness. She wondered how many of those encounters had ended differently than hers was likely to end. The breakthrough came when the creature discovered her truck's air horn as it was examining the front of the vehicle. One of its hands accidentally activated the horn, producing a blast of sound that echoed across the empty highway. The creature leaped backward, clearly startled by the noise, and Jennifer saw her opportunity. She laid on the horn continuously, filling the night with the harsh sound of her truck's air system. The creature backed away from the vehicle, its hands covering its ears, obviously distressed by the auditory assault. Jennifer kept her hand on the horn button and simultaneously put the truck in gear, easing forward slowly. The creature retreated toward the tree, but it did not flee entirely. Instead, it paced back and forth at the edge of the forest, watching as Jennifer's truck began to move. She could see its eyes reflecting her headlights, tracking her movement, and she had the distinct impression that it was memorizing her truck, studying the vehicle that had defeated its attempts to reach the human inside. As Jennifer drove past the spot where the creature had first appeared, she looked in her mirrors and saw something that made her press the accelerator harder. The creature was following her truck, running parallel to the highway through the trees, keeping pace with her vehicle, even as she accelerated to 60 miles per hour. Whatever this thing was, it was fast enough and persistent enough to track vehicles for extended distances. Jennifer maintained radio contact with other truckers as she continued north toward Atlanta, describing her encounter and warning them to be alert for unusual animal activity near mile marker 67. Several drivers reported that they had heard strange howling sounds from the forest along that stretch of highway, but none had seen the creature itself. It was not until she reached the truck stop in Cordell, 30 miles north of her encounter, that Jennifer felt safe enough to stop. As she parked under the bright lights of the fuel island, she noticed scratches on her truck's hood and doors where the creature had tested its grip on the metal. The marks were deep enough to have been made by claws or extremely strong fingernails, and they were positioned at heights that confirmed the creature's impossible size. Jennifer reported her encounter to the Georgia State Patrol, but the response was skeptical at best. The dispatcher took her information politely, but made it clear that reports of large unknown animals were not a high priority for law enforcement. She was advised to file a report with the Department of Natural Resources if she wanted to pursue the matter further. Over the following weeks, Jennifer researched her encounter obsessively, searching online for similar reports from other drivers or local residents. What she discovered was a pattern of sightings stretching back decades, concentrated along the interstate corridors of rural Georgia and northern Florida. Truckers, hunters, and late-night travelers had reported encounters with large bipedal creatures that showed unusual intelligence and apparent familiarity with human technology. 7-1. Most disturbing were the reports of vehicles found abandoned along remote stretches of highway, their occupants never located despite extensive search efforts. Some of these vehicles showed evidence of attempts to break in from the outside, scratched paint, damaged door handles, broken windows, but authorities had always attributed the damage to vandalism or attempts at theft. Jennifer began to wonder if some of those abandoned vehicles had been the sites of encounters like hers, but with drivers who had not been fortunate enough to escape. She wondered if somewhere in the deep forest of the rural South, there were creatures that had learned to associate the sound of truck engines with the possibility of prey. She never drove that stretch of Interstate 95 again, always taking alternate routes that added hours to her trips between Florida and Georgia. But Jennifer continued to monitor trucker forms and police reports, looking for
other encounters with the things she had faced that night. Near mile marker 67, the reports continued to come in, always following the same pattern. Large, intelligent, bipedal creature approaching stopped vehicles, testing for ways to reach the humans inside, displaying problem-solving abilities that suggested these encounters were not random animal behavior but calculated hunting strategies. Jennifer eventually left the trucking industry entirely, unable to shake the memory of those intelligent,
with eyes studying her through the windshield, calculating the best way to reach the prey trapped inside the metal shell. She knew that somewhere in the darkness between cities, in the spaces where civilization grows thin and ancient things still roam, there are creatures that have learned to hunt along the highways. She knew that the next time such a creature encountered a driver who was less prepared, less fortunate, or simply in a less secure vehicle, the outcome might be very different. And she knew that until someone took these reports serious, the highways of rural America would continue to be hunting grounds for things that should not exist. But the scratches on her truck were repaired, but Jennifer kept photographs of them, along with her detailed account of that night. Near mile marker 67, she shared her story with anyone who would listen, hoping that other drivers would be prepared if they ever found themselves face to face with something that walks upright in the darkness, something that knows enough about human technology to understand that metal containers hold prey inside, and something intelligent enough to keep learning from each encounter until it finds a way to succeed. Jennifer never learned what the creature was or where it came from, but she learned something more important. There are things sharing the highways with professional drivers that do not appear in any field guide or wildlife manual. Things that have adapted to hunt in the modern world while remaining invisible to most of the people they prey upon. The thing in her headlights was real, and it was still out there waiting for the next truck to break down or stop in the wrong place at the wrong time. Somewhere in the forest, along Interstate 95, something that should not exist was learning from its encounter with Jennifer Walsh, preparing for the next time it heard the sound of diesel engines in the darkness. Listen.